All right, so let's talk about the bond market. What is the bond market and how does it function inside the financial system of the US? There's lots of confusion around the bond market, but bonds are basically only IOUs. They are promises to pay back a loan with interest. They're a very important source of funding for corporations, especially in the US. Here's a picture of a bond. You can see a couple key factors: the amount of the bond, what is the interest rate being promised on the bond, who is selling the bond. In this case, it's the US government borrowing money, probably to fund a deficit. The bond market functions inside the financial system as one of the ways to channel funds from savers to borrowers. It also funds government debt, which we just saw an example of. It spreads risk amongst borrowers. So savers can lend their extra income basically to anybody that needs to borrow it. But if you loaned to only one person, that would be a very high risk. Through the banking and bond system, your money gets pooled with other savers and then lent out in pools to a bunch of different people. So there's diversification that reduces risk. And it creates liquidity. If you've got an asset and you need cash and you don't necessarily want to sell off the asset, or it might not be saleable very quickly, the bond and financial markets can handle that. But as with all strangers getting together and lending each other money, there are risks. So what are the risks for bonds? Default, term, and liquidity. Let's cover each in turn. Default risk is simply the risk that your loan won't be repaid. So high rates of default are found in things like credit cards, and you'll notice the higher the default risk, the higher the interest being required. So companies are given credit ratings to help investors assess risk, because it's not always easy to see how risky a borrower is going to be. So when you have really good credit and you're a low default risk, you're labeled something like AAA or maybe AA, and you don't have to pay as much interest because there's less risk to the lender. But if the worse your credit is, the increased default risk that you have, you're going to end up paying higher interest rates. And no one needs to remind us right now, the future is very uncertain. So the risk that arises from that uncertainty is called term risk. You're tying up your money, and that involves an opportunity cost. What else could you be doing with that money? So the longer the length of the loan, the more term risk there is, because the more the future is unfolding, and that future necessarily is uncertain. And so the longer the term of the loan, generally speaking, we think there's going to be a higher interest rate to cover that risk. And finally, liquidity risk. If you need to sell an asset quickly, you may not be able to get a good price for it, or you may not even be able to sell it at all. That's called liquidity risk. And that is part of buying any financial instrument. Cash is very liquid. Bonds, stocks, and other assets are less so. And so that carries a risk. Let's talk about this specific class of bonds that come from the US government. They are the safest investment, believe it or not. Bonds that are issued by the US government are called treasuries, and they're traded, a lot of them are traded every day around the world. And they carry some of the very lowest interest rates amongst all investments, which gives you a clue as to their risk, their perception of their risk. And as of today, I just Googled this, Treasury bonds are paying anywhere between 0.12% and 1.4%. Guess which ones are the shorter term? That's right. The shorter term ones have the lowest yield or interest rate. So this is a 3-month maturity, and the 30-year ones are 1.4%. So, quick gut check. Which bond probably pays a higher interest rate? I'll give you a minute to think about this. Higher interest rate, longer term. 30-year bond is the right answer. And let's do a second gut check. Which bond probably pays a higher interest rate? A bond issued by Nike, or if you're German, Nike, or a bond issued by the US government? What do you think? Higher interest rate? Who's got more risk? Probably Nike. So, to review, the bond market is part of the financial system that helps channel funds from savers to borrowers and spread risk. However, there's some differences, right? So differences in the size of loans made and the way liquidity is created, but functionally similar. The bond market is also where government agencies borrow money. I've got a little typo here. And bonds are subject to default risk, term risk, and liquidity risk, the three types of risks we mentioned. That's all for now.